In July 2016, Chinese UN peacekeeping soldiers found themselves in the middle of an all-out war in the South Sudanese capital of Juba. After the fiasco, the individual Chinese soldiers and commanders of the United Nations peacekeeping mission were criticized for failing to protect the citizens and millions of dollars worth of humanitarian resources. A Washington-based nonprofit analysis of the battle found Chinese soldiers had abandoned their posts and refused orders to return fire. But is that actually the case, or is it more complicated than that? What does the Battle of Juba tell us about the way the People's Liberation Army fights? How have these little-known events from 2016 changed the Chinese military and their foreign policy today? And what strategic interest does China have in the South Sudan that brought them there in the first place? But before we get into that, I want to tell you about this video's sponsor, Goat Guns. These are non-firing, 1/3 scale, tiny die-cast metal replicas. Goat Guns have every detailed part of the model accurately crafted. Proof of this comes from their over 15,000 5-star reviews. Actually, I was looking through some of those reviews, and you guys found some pretty weird creative ways to express yourself with these, like this doll with demon eyes and an M4A1. You, sir, have deep-seated unresolved problems, but that's okay, so do I. And Goat Guns lets me express my inner sociopath and never ever judges me for it. Father's Day is just around the corner, and if your dad watches the History Channel or your son plays Call of Duty, this gift is guaranteed to put a smile on their face. And now, if you buy a pack of 3, you can save 10% on your order, or a pack of 10 for 20% off. So if you have 20 dads, you're in luck. There's a 90-day return policy and free shipping on qualifying orders. So please consider supporting the channel by grabbing a non-firing replica Goat Gun by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment below. China has been a member of the United Nations Security Council since 1971, but initially they refused to contribute any combat forces or budget to the UN peacekeeping operations. Then, in the 1990s, China began to send non-combatant personnel, like engineers and agricultural advisors, to support the UN missions. But there was a major change to this policy in 2015. China's new president, Xi Jinping, decided to send combat infantry units to the UN for the first time. This proactive approach was a major change to Chinese long-standing policy of non-interference in foreign affairs. This change of heart was partly driven by China's growing energy needs. South Sudan is the first international location of China's state-owned National Petroleum Corporation. They have a 40% stake in a joint venture that operates South Sudan's major oil fields. As China has grown, so too has their UN peacekeeping contributions. They're now responsible for 15% of funding. China's deployed over 30,000 personnel abroad on 30 separate UN missions. Between the year 2000 and 2016, China went from sending 0 soldiers to 2,500. This growing contribution has been appreciated by the international community by most accounts, even if they do have strategic motives for wanting to increase security in the region. But with increased economic rewards from South Sudan oil fields, comes greater security risks. The Sudanese region has been embroiled in conflict for decades, with 2 major civil wars. The Second Sudanese Civil War lasted 22 years and caused 2.5 million casualties. South Sudan became independent in 2011 as a result of the Second Civil War. Unfortunately, political divisions and conflict continued in the new state. South Sudan has 7 different armed factions operating in 9 of their 10 states. If you remember seeing signs years ago about Save Darfur, this is what they were talking about. The necessity of UN peacekeeping blue helmet soldiers is because humanitarian aid shipments are frequently raided and stolen by militia groups to use for themselves or to sell on the black market. International aid workers and journalists are attacked by militia groups. So the way it works is one United Nations area of operations will be Chinese-led, and then a few clicks away there might be a group of American UN peacekeeping soldiers, or a mix hypothetically. Chinese soldiers from the People's Liberation Army were chosen or volunteered to join the UN forces, and they typically do a rotation of 1 year in the field at an outpost or 3 years at a UN headquarters staffing. The Chinese Central Ministry Commission approved the dispatch of 700-strong infantry battalion, including 121 officers and 579 soldiers, deployed to South Sudan in early 2015. This was the first ever Chinese infantry battalion to be sent on an external peacekeeping operation. What are the odds something terrible would happen? By 2016, the Chinese UN forces were primarily responsible for the security of two large protection of civilian sites in the South Sudanese capital of Juba. There were 37,000 displaced civilians sheltering in the camps. A small contingent of 2,500 soldiers, mostly from the Chinese PLA, manned the perimeter and guard towers, as well as patrolled the nearby neighborhoods in this iconic white six-wheeled armored personnel carrier. Now, these old vehicles are mainly designed to stop landmines, not heavy machine guns or RPGs. The Chinese soldiers were tasked with keeping the peace between the president's army and the former vice president's rebel forces. Both sides decided to violate a recent peace agreement and set up military bases right near these UN camps, since the terrain was favorable to them. Both sides fielded artillery and tank units. Chinese peacekeepers, of course, had neither. Heavily outnumbered and outgunned, the Chinese soldiers couldn't have asked for worse battlefield conditions. The United Nations camp perimeter was lightly protected by HESCO barriers, which are filled with sand instead of concrete walls. The guard towers were wooden shacks instead of concrete pillboxes. They had no bullet-resistant glass or reinforced sandbags. No concrete mortar protection zones that you would typically want on a base like this. The entrance gate was a flimsy metal fence instead of a heavy metal blockade. The main defense was barbed wire fences. This place was not set up to prevent a heavy assault. On July 8th, the tension between the two groups exploded into all-out war. The government army forces and the rebel forces rampaged through the city. They did not observe any rules of engagement, attacking hospitals and non-combatants. Estimates placed the rebel forces' strength at over 1,400 soldiers. They looted shops, hospitals, and aid stations. People raced to the UN Chinese protected camps to escape the fighting. But the UN camps came under heavy attack. In the fog of war, both sides were shooting at each other through the refugee camp. The wooden UN guard towers came under heavy machine gun fire. This forced the Chinese peacekeepers to leave and take cover further back. The UN forces were blinded from seeing what was coming their way. Hundreds of bullets, rockets, and artillery peppered the perimeter. The Chinese UN forces retreated deeper into the compound and clustered around the few armored personnel carriers they had. This is when an enemy rocket-propelled grenade struck their APC. It killed 2 Chinese soldiers and wounded 6 others. Enemy militiamen then looted one of the aid warehouses. They stole $30 million worth of United Nations goods. This was enough food to feed over 200,000 people for a month in the famine-stricken nation. Chinese-led UN peacekeepers were pinned down inside the compound and unable to effectively return fire with the weapons and vehicles they had at their disposal. They were unable to prevent militia forces on the streets from going house to house, hunting people down, and committing unspeakable acts just outside the camp. However, individual Chinese forces did resist in isolated pockets. They recovered their weapons that had been left behind during the initial retreat from the perimeter. They deployed tear gas to prevent a stampede among the panicked civilians. The Chinese soldiers successfully protected 9,000 civilians in the center of the compound. The militia forces were ultimately unable to storm the interior of the compound. However, there were 272 confirmed casualties on the first day alone, 20 of which were under UN protection. The Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs insisted if their troops hadn't been there, it would have been much worse. He said, quote, "Chinese peacekeepers, officers, and soldiers remained at their posts, quickly organizing reinforcements and continuing to implement the mandate of UN MISS while rescuing wounded soldiers." UN MISS is the name of the mission in South Sudan. The fight ended on July 11th with a tense ceasefire. It had been a few days of fighting that they had endured. Everyone wanted to know where to point the finger of blame. A report by US Washington-based Civic, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, showed UN leadership had directly ordered Chinese and Ethiopian battalions to leave the base and act as a quick response force. They're supposed to go out, leave the gate, and set up a perimeter, but they refused to go. The reports and other investigations claim there was a complete dereliction of duty by the UN peacekeepers that directly translated to deaths outside the base. The peacekeepers had failed to uphold the UN objective of protecting non-combatants in a conflict zone. Major General Patrick Camera, in charge of the United Nations investigation, wrote a damning report on the Chinese soldiers, stating in 3 days of intense fighting they had failed to uphold the fragile ceasefire. Camera was a former military advisor to the UN Secretary General. He cites an overall lack of leadership, preparedness, and international integration. He states there was a risk-averse culture among UN peacekeepers. In the past 4 decades, Chinese soldiers have had basically zero combat experience. So it's interesting to see that one of the major findings from this report is that they're very risk adverse. They don't have the experience of what it takes to put your life on the line. But official Chinese statements and media reports refute these claims. Ye Gang, a retired PLA colonel and military analyst, said UN peacekeeping rules limit troops to defensive equipment and vehicles that offer little protection or firepower. It wasn't like the Chinese soldiers had their own infantry fighting vehicles or main battle tanks and artillery. The Civic report states problems that were outside the average Chinese soldier's hands. Quote, "It was always a dreadful idea to have the military base so close to the UN house. It totally undermined our efforts to uphold the civilian characteristics of the sites." While UN MISC clearly underperformed in its response to many aspects of the July violence, the placement of military targets and the consequence in terms of where and how the fighting unfolded put the mission in a terrible place operationally. The report found during combat there were repeated questions by Chinese soldiers over the radio about what the rules of engagement even were. The PLA soldiers had not been properly trained on their mission. That means that they're asking their leadership, hey, when are we allowed to shoot? Who are we allowed to shoot at? Because there's 2 armies that are basically firing at them at this point. It's the most confusing situation you could ask for. Orders were flat out ignored by Chinese soldiers because they came from a different source than they were used to. They weren't flexible enough. Cameron writes, soldiers did not operate under a unified command, resulting in multiple and sometimes conflicting orders to 4 troop contingents from China, Ethiopia, Nepal, and India, and ultimately underusing the more than 1,800 infantry troops at the headquarters. PLA soldiers in the past have been criticized for drilling and training to follow a rigid command structure, so they weren't flexible enough to take orders from Ethiopian command and United Nations command above them. There was also evidence of a lack of basic medical training and CASEVAC procedures by the PLA soldiers. The second Chinese soldier passed away at 11 a.m. the following morning. This was 16 hours after the initial RPG attack. The UN MISC facility only had a level 1 clinic suitable for treating sick and malnourished refugees, but Level 1 clinics lack the necessary surgical tools and transfusions. The Chinese forces requested medical evacuation to a better equipped facility called Tongpang Compound 15 kilometers away, but there was no escort available for the ambulance to make it through the intense fighting, so they never ended up going. Military personnel later testified they believed the second Chinese soldier would have survived if they'd been evacuated. The Civic report attests that the death of the 2 Chinese soldiers had a profound effect on the morale of the remaining UN soldiers. Afterwards, they were more cautious than normal. More than 2 months after the crisis, the report states Chinese peacekeepers still did not conduct regular foot patrols, standing patrols, or patrols outside its perimeter at night. Quote, when the mission does conduct patrols, its soldiers peer out from the tiny windows of armored personnel carriers. I think this is likely because they knew if they were injured, there was no guarantee they would receive the proper medical care. Not by coincidence, just a year later in 2017, China instituted a major restructuring of their military. This undoubtedly played a part in China's decision to form a strategic support force and joint logistics support force that directly interfaces with the new Chinese theater commands. Analysts thought this tactical failure might lead to China shrinking from the future peacekeeping missions, but they sent a rotation of an even larger 925-strong infantry battalion to replace the first unit in South Sudan. The reason peacekeeping is so important here for China is because roughly 5% of China's oil imports come from Sudan. Better security will allow for even more petroleum exploitation. Sudan has 3.5 million barrels of oil in proven reserves. To Chinese investors, South Sudan looks more like an opportunity than a humanitarian crisis. They have huge infrastructure needs, no native industry, and no Western competition. Bilateral trade before the South Sudan Civil War was around $500 million between China and the new nation. And one of the major points of criticism against China's peacekeeping operations here is that they are also arming the conflict at the same time, which is kind of like throwing fuel on a fire that you're trying to put out. China's own Norinco Defense Company sold South Sudan's government 100 anti-tank guided missiles, 10,000 rifles, and 24 million rounds of ammo. It's an open secret in geopolitics that nations always act in their own self-interest, even when appearing to act on behalf of someone else's. The Modern War Institute at West Point characterized the issue well by saying, while self-serving, Beijing's approach is not necessarily a bad thing and does not negatively impact peacekeeping. As the PRC achieves its own economic, military, and reputational goals, UN peacekeeping is better funded, better trained, and better manned to carry out today's complex missions. Most other troop-contributing countries are similarly driven to participate out of self-interest. This could explain why China has over 1,000 troops continually deployed in South Sudan. It's not just the right thing to do, but it's also in their best interest to foster stability and development in the country. And above all else, the Chinese UN peacekeepers avoid the kind of scrutiny that you would get about the sovereignty concerns that would normally come with news of building a Chinese military base in South Sudan. China often gets a bad rap, and I'm often critical of them, but their troops fought hard to protect the people in South Sudan that day under difficult conditions with limited resources and limited equipment and firepower. There were many considerations that were out of their control. A total of 18 Chinese nationals have been killed while on UN peacekeeping missions, according to UN data. These deaths are rarely talked about since they're not in a regular Chinese army unit. Regardless of the geopolitical power plays that all nations engage in, soldiers putting themselves at risk to protect the innocent and vulnerable is always a noble goal, and we would like to recognize the sacrifices of Yang Shupeng and Li Lai, who died in July 2016 in defense of others. If you want to support the content, you can join our members-only tier for our exclusive content, or purchase this Fubar and Grill t-shirt. Fubar and Grill is where all of us average soldiers go to bullshit, and it's a way we can recognize who's in the spare parts army when we're out at a mall in New Jersey. I'm your average infantryman, Cappy. Until next time.